The letter arrived at the Double J Ranch on a Tuesday morning in March of 1882, and Ethan Jameson held it in his calloused hands like it might explode at any moment, his heart hammering against his ribs as he read the words that would change everything he thought he knew about the mail-order bride arrangement he had entered into 6 weeks prior. Dear Mr. Jameson, I am writing to inform you that I will be arriving on the 16th of April as planned, but I must confess something that may alter your willingness to honor our agreement. My grandmother, who raised me after my parents passed when I was 8 years old, has no other family besides myself. I cannot and will not leave her behind in Philadelphia. She is 72 years old, sharp of mind and still capable, but she requires my care and companionship. If this arrangement is unacceptable to you, I will understand completely and harbor no ill will. However, I felt honesty was paramount before making such a monumental journey. Respectfully, Penelope Nash. Ethan stood on the porch of his ranch house, the Arizona sun already warming the high desert landscape around Oro Blanco, and read the letter 3 more times. He was 31 years old, had been working this land for the better part of a decade, and had finally admitted to himself 6 months ago that the loneliness was eating him alive from the inside out. The ranch hands came and went, but at the end of each day he returned to an empty house that echoed with silence. He had never considered himself the type of man who would send away for a bride, but his neighbor's wife had convinced him otherwise during a church social last autumn. There are good women back east who need fresh starts just as much as you need companionship, she had said with a knowing smile. So he had written to the agency, been matched with Miss Penelope Nash, a 23-year-old seamstress from Philadelphia, and now here he was, holding a letter that most men would probably see as a complication they did not need. But Ethan Jameson was not most men. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, then looked out over the rolling hills dotted with cattle. His mother had lived with them until her death 3 years ago, and he remembered how much richer their dinner table had been with her stories and wisdom. The house had felt alive then, full of the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace and everything to do with family. He walked back inside, sat down at his oak desk, and pulled out a sheet of paper. His handwriting was not elegant, but it was honest, and he wrote quickly before he could second-guess himself. Dear Miss Nash, your honesty is appreciated and respected. Bring your grandmother. My home has plenty of room, and I suspect it will be far richer for her presence. A life is not measured by how convenient it is, but by the love and loyalty we show to those who matter. I look forward to meeting both of you on the 16th. Ethan Jameson. He posted the letter that same afternoon, and then the waiting began. The weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness. He found himself preparing the house in ways he had not initially planned, opening up the guest bedroom on the main floor that would be easier for an elderly woman to access, making sure the porch had a sturdy railing, asking his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, to help him air out all the linens and stock the pantry with extra supplies. You are a good man, Mr. Jameson, Mrs. Chen said as she beat dust from a quilt in the yard. She was a Chinese immigrant who had come west with her husband to work on the railroad, and after his death 5 years ago, Ethan had hired her to help manage the household. She came 3 times a week and had become something of a friend in the process. I am just doing what is right, he replied, feeling self-conscious. That is what makes you good, she said with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. The 16th of April finally arrived, bright and clear, and Ethan rode into Oro Blanco in his best suit, his horse freshly brushed, his own dark hair still damp from the bath he had taken at dawn. The town was small but growing, built around the silver mines that had drawn people from all over the country and beyond. The stage-coach station sat at the north end of the main street, flanked by the general store and the assay office. He was not the only person waiting for the stage. 3 miners stood nearby, probably expecting supplies. The station manager, old Tom Hendricks, tipped his hat to Ethan. "Heard you got a bride coming in today." "News travels fast," Ethan said, trying not to sound annoyed. "Small town," Tom said with a shrug. "Nothing wrong with it." "You have been alone too long out at that ranch." Before Ethan could respond, he heard the rumble of wheels and the thunder of hooves. The stagecoach appeared down the dusty road, 6 horses pulling it at a steady clip, the driver calling out commands. Ethan's heart jumped into his throat. His hands suddenly felt too large and clumsy, and he wondered what he would say, how he would seem to a woman who had traveled 2,000 miles based on letters and a single photograph. The stage rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust. The driver climbed down and opened the door, handing out first a young woman in a gray traveling dress, her dark blonde hair pinned up under a simple bonnet. She was pretty in a wholesome, understated way, with clear blue eyes that swept the scene with obvious nervousness. This had to be Penelope. But Ethan's attention was immediately drawn to the second passenger the driver was helping down. An elderly woman with silver hair emerged, her back remarkably straight, her eyes bright and assessing. She wore a black dress that had seen better days but was immaculately clean, and she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. "Mr. Jameson," the younger woman said, stepping forward tentatively. "Miss Nash," Ethan replied, removing his hat. "Welcome to Oro Blanco." She smiled, and it transformed her face from pretty to genuinely lovely. "Thank you for allowing us both to come. This is my grandmother, Dorothy Nash." The older woman extended her hand, not to be shaken, but in the old-fashioned way that suggested Ethan should bow over it, which he did, feeling slightly foolish but also charmed. "Mrs. Nash, it is an honor." "Mr. Jameson," Dorothy said, her voice strong and clear. "My granddaughter has told me much about you in your letters. I hope we will not be too much of a burden." "No burden at all," Ethan said firmly. "My home is your home now." He saw something shift in Penelope's expression then, a softening around her eyes, a release of tension in her shoulders. She had been braced for rejection or resentment, he realized, and his acceptance meant more than he could have understood. "Let me get your trunks," he said, moving to help the driver unload the luggage. There were 3 trunks, which he loaded into the wagon he had brought for this purpose. He helped both women up onto the seat, with Dorothy in the middle and Penelope on the other side, then climbed up himself and took the reins. The ride out to the ranch took 40 minutes, and it gave them time to talk. Penelope asked questions about the area, about the ranch, about his cattle operation. Dorothy mostly observed, but Ethan could feel her eyes on him, assessing, judging. He did not blame her. She was entrusting her granddaughter's future to a complete stranger. "How long have you been in Arizona, Mr. Jameson?" Dorothy finally asked. 12 years, madam. I came out here when I was 19, worked for another rancher for 2 years, then bought my own land and built it up from there." "That must have been difficult work." "It was, but I have always preferred difficult work to an easy chair," he said. "My father was a banker back in Missouri, wanted me to follow in his footsteps, but I needed open sky and honest labor." "A man should follow his own path," Dorothy said with an approving nod. "Too many people live the lives others choose for them." They talked about Philadelphia, about the seamstress shop where Penelope had worked, about the small apartment they had shared above a bakery. "The city was crowded and loud," Penelope said, gazing at the wide open landscape around them. I always dreamed of space and silence. You will find plenty of both here, Ethan said with a slight smile. When the ranch house came into view, he watched their reactions carefully. It was not a mansion, but it was solid and well-built, a two-story structure with a wide porch, painted white with dark blue shutters. The barn and outbuildings were in good repair, and the corrals held about 30 horses. In the distance, cattle dotted the grassland. "It is beautiful," Penelope said softly. "It is honest," Dorothy added, and somehow that felt like an even greater compliment. Mrs. Chen came out to meet them, wiping her hands on her apron. Ethan made introductions, and the older woman immediately took charge. "Come, come, you must be exhausted. I have prepared rooms and made lunch. Mr. Jameson, bring the trunks inside." Over the next few hours, the house came alive in a way it had not since his mother's death. Mrs. Chen showed the women to their rooms, Dorothy taking the ground-floor bedroom and Penelope the one directly above it. Ethan heard their exclamations of pleasure at the comfortable furnishings, the clean linens, the small touches he and Mrs. Chen had added like fresh wildflowers in vases and extra quilts folded at the foot of each bed. Lunch was served in the dining room, a simple meal of chicken stew and fresh bread, but it felt like a feast because the table was full. Dorothy told stories about Philadelphia in the old days before the war, when she had been a young bride herself. Penelope added details about their neighborhood, about the colorful characters who lived on their street. Ethan found himself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in months. After lunch, he showed Penelope around the ranch while Dorothy rested. They walked to the barn first, where he introduced her to his favorite horse, a bay mare named Copper. "Do you ride?" he asked. "I have only ridden a few times, but I would like to learn properly," she said, reaching out to stroke Copper's nose. The horse nickered softly and leaned into her touch. "She likes you," Ethan observed. "She is usually more standoffish with strangers." "I have always gotten along better with animals than people," Penelope admitted. "Is that strange?" "Not to me," he said. "Animals are honest. They do not pretend to be something they are not." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. "You are different from what I expected," she said quietly. "Better or worse?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light even though his heart was racing. "Better," she said simply. "Much better. When you wrote that letter, accepting my grandmother without hesitation, I thought perhaps you were too good to be true. But meeting you, seeing your home, I think perhaps you are simply good, and that is rare." Ethan felt heat rise in his face. He was not accustomed to such direct praise. "I am just a man trying to do right by people," he said. "Nothing special about that." "Everything special about that," she countered. They continued the tour, walking through the orchards he had planted 3 years ago, now showing the first signs of spring growth. He explained his plans for expanding the cattle operation, for building a better irrigation system, for creating something lasting. She listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions that showed she was not just being polite, but truly wanted to understand his work. "Would you want to be involved in running the ranch?" he asked as they stood on a small rise overlooking the property. "I mean, if we go through with the marriage, this would be your home too, your livelihood." "I would like that," she said. "I am not afraid of hard work, Mr. Jameson." "Ethan," he said. "Please call me Ethan." "Ethan," she repeated, and the sound of his name on her lips sent a pleasant shiver down his spine. "And you must call me Penelope, or Penny if you prefer. My grandmother is the only one who still uses my full name most of the time." "Penelope suits you," he said. "It is a name with dignity and strength." She smiled at that, and they stood together in companionable silence, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western horizon. That evening, the four of them gathered for dinner, with Mrs. Chen joining them at Dorothy's insistence. "You are not a servant here," the older woman had declared. "You are part of this household and you will eat with us." Mrs. Chen had looked to Ethan for confirmation and he had nodded. "Please join us. Mrs. Nash is right." Over roasted chicken and vegetables from the root cellar, they talked about the wedding. "We should wait a few weeks," Ethan suggested. "Give everyone time to get to know each other, make sure this is truly what we all want." "That is very considerate," Penelope said, relief evident in her voice. "But not too long," Dorothy interjected with a knowing smile. "You are not getting any younger, either of you, and I would like to see great-grandchildren before I leave this earth." "Grandmother!" Penelope's face turned bright red. Ethan could not help but laugh. "I appreciate your directness, Mrs. Nash. Call me Dorothy, young man. We are going to be family after all." The days that followed fell into a natural rhythm. Ethan rose before dawn to work with his ranch hands, 5 men who lived in the bunkhouse and had been with him for years. He introduced Penelope to them, and they were respectful if a bit shy around the newcomer. She won them over by the end of the first week when she helped Mrs. Chen bring out fresh baked bread and apple butter for their lunch break. "Boys," one of the older hands, a Mexican man named Miguel, said to Ethan later, "you picked a good one. She has kind eyes." Penelope spent her days learning the household routine from Mrs. Chen, exploring the property and caring for her grandmother. But Dorothy was far from an invalid. The older woman took charge of the kitchen garden, declaring that she had been growing vegetables for 50 years and was not about to stop now. She also began the process of organizing Ethan's chaotic book collection, which had been piled haphazardly in the study. "A man's library tells you about his soul," she said one evening as Ethan came in from work to find her cataloging his books. "You have good taste, philosophy, history, poetry, but no organization whatsoever." "I always meant to get around to it," he said sheepishly. "Now you do not have to," she replied with a wink. In the evenings, they would gather in the parlor. Sometimes Dorothy would read aloud from one of the books, her voice strong and expressive. Other times, Penelope would sew while Ethan worked on ranch accounts. They would talk about everything and nothing, building the kind of comfortable familiarity that could not be rushed. One night, about 2 weeks after their arrival, Ethan and Penelope sat together on the porch after Dorothy had gone to bed. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by city lights, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage and mesquite. "Do you ever regret coming here?" Ethan asked quietly. Penelope turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the lamplight spilling through the window. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Do you regret accepting both of us?" "Never," he said firmly. "Dorothy has brought something precious to this home. Her stories, her wisdom, her spirit. She reminds me of my mother in the best ways, and you," he trailed off, suddenly uncertain, "and me." She prompted gently. "You make me remember what it is like to look forward to coming home at the end of the day," he admitted. "To want to share what happened, to hear about your day, to just sit in silence together. I had forgotten how much I missed that." She reached over and took his hand, the first truly intimate gesture between them. Her fingers were small and warm in his, calloused from needlework but soft despite that. "I feel the same way," she said. "I was so scared when I boarded that stagecoach in Philadelphia. Scared that I was making a terrible mistake, that you would be cruel or indifferent, that I would be trapped in a loveless arrangement. But you have been nothing but kind and patient and good. I want you to be happy here," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "Truly happy, not just content." "I think I could be," she said, and then, more firmly, "I think I already am." They set the wedding date for the first Saturday in May, giving them nearly a month to prepare. The local preacher, Reverend Matthews, came out to the ranch to meet Penelope and Dorothy and discuss the ceremony. He was a jovial man in his 50s, with a booming voice and a warm smile. "It does my heart good to see this," he said as they sat in the parlor discussing the details. "Mr. Jameson has been alone too long, and Miss Nash, you seem like just the kind of steady, sensible woman this territory needs more of." "And what about me?" Dorothy asked with mock indignation. "Am I not worth mentioning?" "Madam, you are a force of nature, and I would not dare attempt to categorize you," the Reverend replied with a grin. "But I will say that Oro Blanco is lucky to have you. We are desperately short on elders with wisdom and experience." "Then perhaps I shall have to involve myself in community affairs," Dorothy said thoughtfully. "It has been too long since I had a project beyond keeping my granddaughter out of trouble." "I was never in trouble," Penelope protested. "Only because I kept such a close eye on you," Dorothy shot back, and everyone laughed. The wedding preparations consumed the household in the best possible way. Mrs. Chen helped Penelope alter a dress, adding lace and embroidery to transform a simple Sunday dress into something worthy of a bride. Miguel's wife, Rosa, who lived in town, came out to help with the cooking preparations for the small celebration they planned after the ceremony. Dorothy took charge of decorating, draping the parlor with wildflowers and greenery that she and Penelope gathered from around the property. "A wedding should feel like a celebration of new life," she declared. "Nature's beauty is more honest than anything we could buy." Ethan found himself caught up in the excitement, despite his usual reserved nature. He had a new suit made by the tailor in town, helped the hands clean and organize the barn for the dance they planned to hold there after dinner, and spent an afternoon with Miguel selecting a suitable wedding gift. "What do you give a woman who crossed a continent to marry you?" he asked as they browsed the limited selection in the general store. "Something that shows you were paying attention," Miguel said wisely. "Something that says you see her, not just as your bride, but as herself." Ethan thought about that for a long time. He finally settled on two things: a beautiful leather-bound journal with crisp, empty pages, because Penelope had mentioned once that she used to keep a diary but had filled her last one before leaving Philadelphia, and a silver brooch in the shape of a horse, because he had noticed how much time she spent with Copper and the other horses, how her face lit up when she was around them. The night before the wedding, Dorothy asked to speak with him privately. They sat in the study, the older woman in the comfortable armchair by the window, Ethan perched on the edge of the desk. "I want to thank you," she said without preamble, "for accepting me, for making a home for me, but most of all for seeing my Penelope for who she truly is." "She is easy to see," Ethan replied. "She does not hide herself behind false pretenses." "No, she does not," Dorothy agreed, "but many men would not value that. They would want a meek, silent woman who does nothing but agree and obey. You are not that kind of man, and I am grateful." "I want a partner," Ethan said honestly. "Someone to build a life with, not someone to control or diminish. Penelope is smart and capable and strong." "Why would I want anything less than her full self?" Dorothy smiled, and her eyes were suspiciously bright. "You are going to make her very happy, I think, and she will make you happy in return. That is all an old woman can ask for." "You are not just an old woman," Ethan said gently. "You are part of this family now. This ranch, this home, it is richer for your presence. I meant what I said in my letter." "I know you did," she said, reaching over to pat his hand. "That is why I trusted you with her." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the Arizona sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Ethan dressed carefully in his new suit, his hands shaking slightly as he knotted his tie. He had faced down stampedes and drought and all manner of challenges in his years as a rancher, but nothing had made him as nervous as this. Miguel came to fetch him when it was time. "She is beautiful, amigo," he said quietly, "and she looks at you like you hung the moon." The ceremony was held in the parlor, with Reverend Matthews officiating and about 20 guests squeezed into the space, including the ranch hands. Mrs. Chen and her adult son from Tucson, Rosa and her children, and a few neighbors from surrounding ranches. Dorothy sat in the place of honor, her silver hair gleaming, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. And then Penelope appeared at the top of the stairs, and Ethan forgot how to breathe. The dress was simple but elegant, white with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, her hair arranged in soft waves that framed her face. But it was her expression that stopped his heart, the joy and hope and, yes, love, that shone in her eyes as she looked at him. She descended the stairs, her hand trailing along the banister, her gaze never leaving his face. When she reached him, he took her hand, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, and Ethan tried to focus on the words, but he was too aware of Penelope beside him, the scent of the lavender water she wore, the warmth of her hand in his, the way her breath caught when he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend finally said, and Ethan cupped Penelope's face gently in his hands, seeing his future in her eyes, before leaning down to kiss her softly. It was chaste and brief, appropriate for the audience, but it sent electricity down his spine nonetheless. The parlor erupted in applause and cheers. Dorothy was openly crying now, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mrs. Chen was beaming. Miguel let out a celebratory whoop that made everyone laugh. The celebration that followed was everything a wedding should be: joyful, abundant, and full of love. Rosa had outdone herself with the food, a mixture of traditional American dishes and the Mexican recipes she had grown up with. The barn had been transformed with lanterns and bunting, and one of the ranch hands played the fiddle while people danced. Ethan and Penelope led the first dance, stumbling through a waltz that neither of them quite remembered the steps to, laughing at their own clumsiness. Then Dorothy insisted on dancing with Ethan, and despite her age she was light on her feet and graceful. "Take care of her," Dorothy said as they turned slowly to the music. "Love her well and truly." "I will," Ethan promised, "every day for the rest of my life." As evening turned to night and the stars came out, Ethan and Penelope finally slipped away from the celebration, walking together to the main house while the party continued in the barn. The sounds of music and laughter followed them, a warm backdrop to their first moments alone as husband and wife. Inside, Ethan felt suddenly awkward, aware that Penelope was now his wife in every sense, that she would be sharing his bedroom, his life, his future. But she took his hand and led him to the stairs, her touch steady and sure. "I am nervous," she admitted when they reached the bedroom door. "So am I," he said honestly. She smiled at that. "Good. That makes it better somehow, knowing we are navigating this together." What happened between them that night was private and tender and tinged with the awkwardness of first times, but it was also beautiful in its honesty. They learned each other slowly, with patience and care, and when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Ethan knew he had found something he had stopped believing existed. A true partner, a genuine love, a home that was more than just walls and land. The weeks that followed were an adjustment for everyone. Penelope threw herself into learning the ranch operations, riding out with Ethan most mornings to check on the cattle, learning to recognize the different sections of the property, understanding the rhythms of ranch life. She had a natural aptitude for it, and Ethan found himself relying on her insights more and more. Dorothy became the unofficial heart of the household. She kept the kitchen garden flourishing, made sure everyone was fed and cared for, and offered wisdom to anyone who asked, and sometimes to people who did not. The ranch hands adored her, often stopping by the kitchen for advice on everything from stubborn horses to matters of the heart. One evening in late June, as they all sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Dorothy said quietly, "I never thought I would be this happy again. After my husband died, after Penelope's parents were taken by the fever, I thought joy was behind me. But this place, this family, you have given me a reason to wake up smiling." Penelope reached over to squeeze her grandmother's hand, tears in her eyes. "You gave me everything, grandmother. You raised me, loved me, taught me to be strong. I am so glad you are here to see this, to be part of this." "As am I," Dorothy said, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan sat beside his wife, his arm around her shoulders, and felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was what mattered, not the size of the ranch or the number of cattle or any measure of material success. This moment, this family, this love. As summer deepened into the fierce heat of July and August, the ranch settled into a steady routine. They were blessed with good rain that year, and the grass stayed green longer than usual. The cattle fattened, the garden produced abundantly, and the ranch prospered. In September, Penelope began to suspect she might be pregnant. She waited 2 weeks to be sure before telling Ethan, catching him alone in the barn one evening. "I think I am carrying our child," she said without preamble, her eyes bright with hope and fear. Ethan stood very still, the pitchfork he had been using forgotten in his hands. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing a doctor," she said. "I have missed my monthly courses twice now, and I feel different, tired, and my stomach is unsettled in the mornings." He set down the pitchfork and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. "This is wonderful news," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have made me the happiest man alive." "You are not worried?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Worried about what?" "About whether I will be a good mother, about the dangers of childbirth, about everything changing." He pulled back to look at her face, cupping her cheek in his palm. "You will be an extraordinary mother. As for the rest, we will face it together. You, me, and Dorothy. We are a family, and families take care of each other." They told Dorothy that evening after dinner, and the older woman's reaction was everything they could have hoped for. She let out a cry of joy and hugged them both, tears streaming down her face. "A baby," she kept saying. "A new life, a new generation. Oh, what a blessing." Over the next months, they all fussed over Penelope, perhaps too much. Ethan tried to keep her from doing any heavy work. Dorothy monitored her diet obsessively, and Mrs. Chen made special teas that were supposed to ease morning sickness. Penelope bore it all with patient amusement, insisting she was pregnant, not fragile. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she said one day when Ethan tried to stop her from helping with the laundry. "I am not going to break." "I know," he said, "but I cannot help wanting to protect you." "Then protect me by treating me like myself," she replied gently. "I need to feel useful, not coddled." He learned to balance his protective instincts with respect for her independence, and their relationship deepened because of it. They talked about everything: what they would name the baby, how they would raise it, what values they wanted to instill. They dreamed aloud about the future, about adding to their family, about building something lasting for generations to come. Winter came, mild by most standards but cold enough in the high desert. Penelope grew round with the baby, her face glowing with health despite the occasional discomfort. Dorothy knitted baby clothes with a fervor, determined that her great-grandchild would have the finest handmade layettes in the territory. In February of 1883, on a Tuesday morning when the first hints of spring were showing in the budding mesquite trees, Penelope went into labor. Ethan rode into town at breakneck speed to fetch the doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Sarah Winters, who had come west from Boston to practice medicine where she would not face as much prejudice about her gender. The labor was long but not dangerously so. Dorothy stayed with Penelope the entire time, coaching her through the contractions, wiping her face with cool cloths, telling her she was strong and brave and doing beautifully. Dr. Winters managed the medical aspects with calm competence. Ethan paced downstairs, wearing a path in the parlor carpet, jumping every time he heard a sound from above. Miguel and Mrs. Chen sat with him, offering quiet company. Finally, as the sun was setting on that winter day, he heard the thin, wavering cry of a newborn. His heart stopped, then started again at triple speed. He was halfway up the stairs when Dr. Winters appeared at the top, still in her shirt sleeves, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A healthy, strong boy, and your wife is doing wonderfully." Ethan took the steps 2 at a time and burst into the bedroom. Penelope lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale with exhaustion, but she had never looked more beautiful. In her arms, wrapped in one of Dorothy's knitted blankets, was a tiny red-faced baby with a shock of dark hair. "Come meet your son," Penelope said softly. Ethan approached slowly, almost reverently. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the impossibly small person in his wife's arms. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut, his little fists waving in the air, and Ethan felt his entire world realign around this new life. "He is perfect," he whispered. "We thought we might name him Edward," Penelope said, "after your father, if that would please you." Ethan felt his eyes burn with unexpected tears. His relationship with his father had been complicated, but the gesture touched him deeply. "Edward Jameson," he said, testing the name. "Yes, that is perfect." Dorothy stood by the window, giving them their moment, but she was smiling so widely her face looked like it might split. "He has your nose, Ethan," she observed, "but I think he has Penelope's chin." "Poor boy," Ethan said with a watery laugh, and Penelope swatted at him weakly. The weeks after Edward's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and the steep learning curve that came with first-time parenthood. But they navigated it together, all 3 adults taking turns walking the baby when he cried, learning his signals and needs. Dorothy proved invaluable, having raised children and grandchildren, but she was careful not to take over, letting Ethan and Penelope find their own way. Spring came fully, the desert blooming with wildflowers, and they held a small baptism for Edward in the parlor with Reverend Matthews officiating. Miguel and Rosa stood as godparents, a responsibility they took seriously, and the celebration afterward was filled with laughter and joy. As Edward grew from a helpless newborn into an infant who could focus his eyes and smile, Ethan watched his wife blossom into motherhood. She was patient and attentive, but not overprotective, already teaching their son about the world around him through words and songs, and the simple act of being present. One evening in May, as they sat on the porch with Edward sleeping in a basket between them and Dorothy reading in her chair nearby, Ethan said, "Do you remember 1 year ago, we were preparing for our wedding?" "I remember," Penelope said with a soft smile. "I was so nervous I barely slept the night before. And now look at us," he said, gesturing to encompass their little family, the ranch spreading out before them in the gathering dusk, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. "I keep thinking I will wake up and find this was all a dream." If it is, I am dreaming the same dream, she said, reaching over to take his hand. And I never want to wake up. Dorothy looked up from her book. You two are going to make me cry again, she said, but her voice was warm with affection. Good, Ethan said with a grin. You have made us cry often enough with your sentimental stories. Respect your elders, young man, Dorothy shot back, but she was smiling. The years that followed were marked by growth and change, but always underscored by love. Edward thrived, growing into a bright, curious toddler who followed Ethan around the ranch like a shadow, asking endless questions about the horses and cattle and everything else he encountered. In the fall of 1884, Penelope became pregnant again. This time she was less anxious about the process, more confident in her body's ability to carry and deliver a child. Their daughter, Emily, was born in April of 1885, a spring baby with blonde hair like her mother and her father's brown eyes. Dorothy, now approaching 80, remained vigorous and engaged, though Ethan noticed her moving a bit more slowly, needing more rest. But her mind was as sharp as ever, and she doted on her great-grandchildren with a devotion that was beautiful to witness. I am so grateful, she told Ethan one evening as they sat watching Penelope play with the children in the yard. I never imagined I would see this. Great-grandchildren, a home in this beautiful country, a family that loves each other so deeply. You gave us this, Ethan, you and your generous heart. You give me too much credit, he protested. I was just a lonely man who needed a family. You were a man wise enough to see that love comes in many forms, Dorothy corrected gently. You could have rejected me, seen me as a burden. Instead, you welcomed me, valued me, made me feel like I had purpose again. That is not something to dismiss. The ranch continued to prosper. Ethan expanded the cattle operation, bought adjacent land when it became available, and built a reputation for honest dealing and quality stock. Penelope managed the household accounts and took on an increasing role in the business side of the ranch, proving to have a keen head for numbers and negotiation. They hired additional help as needed, but the core group remained the same. Miguel and the other long-time ranch hands, Mrs. Chen, who had become like family, and Rosa, who came out regularly to help with the children and heavier household tasks. In the winter of 1886, Dorothy fell ill with pneumonia. Dr. Winters came out from town and did everything she could, but the older woman's lungs were weak, and the illness had taken a firm hold. They nursed her around the clock, Penelope barely leaving her grandmother's side. On a cold February night with the family gathered in her room, Dorothy passed peacefully in her sleep. Penelope was beside her, holding her hand, and Ethan stood behind his wife with his hands on her shoulders, offering what comfort he could. The grief was profound. Dorothy had been such a vital presence in their lives, the cornerstone of their family. They buried her on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the valley, with a simple but elegant headstone that read, Dorothy Nash, beloved grandmother and friend, who made every home richer with her wisdom. The weeks after were hard. The house felt emptier without Dorothy's stories and laughter. Penelope mourned deeply but not destructively, talking about her grandmother often with the children, making sure they would remember the woman who had loved them so much. She gave me everything, Penelope said one night as she and Ethan lay in bed, her head on his chest. She raised me when my parents died. She supported my decision to come west. She loved our children like they were her own babies. How do I live without her? You live the way she taught you, Ethan said gently. With strength and grace and love, you honor her by being the woman she raised you to be, by passing on her wisdom to Edward and Emily. I miss her so much, Penelope whispered. I know, he said, holding her close. I miss her too. But life, as it always does, continued. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and slowly the acute pain of loss softened into a gentler ache of remembrance. They kept Dorothy's memory alive through stories and the values she had instilled, and in the way they lived their lives with integrity and love. In 1888, their third child was born, another boy they named Daniel. And in 1890, their fourth and final child, a daughter named Grace, completed their family. The ranch house that had once been so empty was now filled with the chaos and joy of children, with the daily dramas of scraped knees and sibling squabbles, with laughter and tears, and all the messy beauty of family life. Ethan watched his children grow with a sense of wonder that never faded. Edward, serious and thoughtful, already showing signs of being a natural rancher. Emily, spirited and independent, more interested in books and learning than cattle. Daniel, the peacemaker, always trying to smooth over conflicts. And Grace, still a toddler, but clearly the baby of the family, spoiled by everyone and loving every minute of it. And through it all, his love for Penelope only deepened. They had built something real and lasting together, a partnership that went beyond romance into true companionship. They could communicate with a look across a crowded room, knew each other's moods and needs instinctively, supported each other through challenges, and celebrated each other's victories. "You ever think about that day you received my letter?" Penelope asked one evening in the fall of 1892. They were alone on the porch, a rare moment of quiet with all four children finally asleep inside. "The one where I told you about grandmother. I think about it often," Ethan admitted. "I almost did not send that reply. I thought about it for hours, wondering if I was making a mistake, if I was taking on more than I could handle. What made you decide to do it?" "Honestly, I thought about my mother. She had lived with us, and her presence had made everything better. I missed that feeling of family, of having generations under one roof. And something in your letter, the loyalty you showed to Dorothy, the way you were willing to sacrifice your own chance at happiness rather than abandon her, that told me everything I needed to know about your character." Penelope leaned her head on his shoulder. "That decision changed my life, our lives. I wish I could go back and tell that frightened girl on the stagecoach how everything was going to turn out." "She probably would not have believed you," Ethan said with a smile. "Probably not," Penelope agreed. "Sometimes I still cannot believe it myself. That I am this happy, that we built this beautiful life together." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets, the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees. "You remember what Dorothy said?" Penelope asked suddenly. "At our wedding, when she danced with you. She told me to take care of you, to love you well and truly. Have you kept that promise?" Ethan turned to look at his wife, seeing the silver just beginning to thread through her blonde hair, the fine lines around her eyes from years of smiling, the face he loved more with each passing day. "Every single day," he said seriously, "and I will continue to keep it for the rest of my life." "Good," she said and kissed him softly, "because I plan to hold you to it." The years continued to roll by, marked by the milestones of their children's lives. Edward took on more responsibility with the ranch, showing a natural talent for working with the cattle and managing the hands. Emily proved to be extraordinarily bright, and Ethan and Penelope arranged for her to attend a boarding school in Tucson for her secondary education, much to her delight. Daniel showed an interest in horses and began working with breaking and training the young stock. And Grace, as she grew, revealed a personality much like Dorothy's had been, strong-willed, wise beyond her years, and possessed of a dry wit that could make anyone laugh. In the spring of 1895, Edward announced his intention to marry a local girl, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. Ethan and Penelope hosted the wedding at the Double J, and as Ethan watched his son pledge his life to the woman he loved, he thought about his own wedding 13 years earlier, about how nervous he had been, how uncertain of the future. "They remind me of us," Penelope whispered beside him during the ceremony. "They do," Ethan agreed, "young and hopeful and ready to build a life together. Do you think they will be as happy as we have been?" "I hope so," he said, taking her hand. "I hope everyone gets to experience what we have." Emily's letters from school were full of enthusiasm for her studies, and she announced her intention to become a teacher, a profession that was becoming more acceptable for women. Penelope was thrilled, though Ethan struggled a bit with the idea of his daughter not returning to the ranch permanently. "She has to follow her own path," Penelope reminded him gently. "Just like you did when you left Missouri against your father's wishes." "I know," he said. "It is just hard to let go." "That is what being a parent is," she said with a sad smile, "loving them enough to let them fly." As the century drew to a close, the ranch had become one of the most successful in the territory. Ethan had built something lasting, not just through hard work and smart business decisions, but through the relationships he had cultivated, the reputation for integrity he had earned, and the family he had raised with Penelope. In the winter of 1899, on a crisp December evening, the entire family gathered for Christmas. Edward and his wife Clara were there with their baby son, the first grandchild, named Thomas. Emily was home from her teaching position in Tucson. Daniel, now 18, and Grace, 9, completed the gathering. They sat around the big dining table that had hosted so many meals over the years, and Ethan looked at all the faces he loved and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. This was what mattered. This was what life was for. Not the accumulation of land or money, but the building of family, the cultivation of love, the passing on of values from one generation to the next. "I want to make a toast," he said, standing and raising his glass. Everyone quieted and looked at him expectantly. 18 years ago, I was a lonely man living in an empty house. I sent away for a mail-order bride, not really believing it would change anything. But Penelope came, and she brought with her the most precious gift, her grandmother Dorothy. He saw Penelope wipe at her eyes, saw Emily smile through her own tears. "Dorothy told me once that I had made my home richer with wisdom by accepting her, but the truth is, she made my home richer just by being herself. She taught me about generosity, about the importance of family, about living with grace and dignity. And she set the foundation for everything we have built here. So this toast is to Dorothy, who is not here in body but is always here in spirit, and to all of you who make every day worth living." "To family, to family," everyone echoed, raising their glasses. As they drank, Penelope caught Ethan's eye across the table and mouthed the words, "I love you." He mouthed them back, and in that moment, surrounded by the family they had created together, he knew that every choice he had made, every risk he had taken, had been worth it. The new century arrived with celebration and hope. The ranch continued to thrive, adapted to new technologies and methods while maintaining the core values that had always guided it. Ethan and Penelope aged gracefully together, their partnership as strong in their 50s as it had been in their youth. Edward took over more of the day-to-day operations of the ranch, proving himself a capable manager and allowing Ethan to step back a bit, to spend more time with Penelope, to travel occasionally, to enjoy the fruits of their decades of hard work. Emily married a fellow teacher she met in Tucson, and they settled in Phoenix, where she continued her work in education. Daniel eventually bought a small horse ranch of his own just a few miles from the Double J, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to have his independence. And Grace, their baby, grew into a remarkable young woman who inherited Dorothy's sharp mind and kind heart. In the summer of 1905, Ethan and Penelope celebrated their 23rd anniversary with a quiet dinner alone on the porch, the same spot where they had spent so many evenings over the years. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not brought grandmother?" Penelope asked, a question she had never posed before. Ethan thought about it seriously. "I think we still would have found happiness together," he said slowly, "but it would have been different. Dorothy brought a dimension to our family, a depth and wisdom that shaped everything. She taught us how to be generous, how to see beyond our own immediate needs and wants. In a very real way, she made us better people." "She would have been so proud to see all of this," Penelope said, gesturing to encompass the ranch, the legacy they had built. "All the grandchildren, the success of the ranch, how happy we are." "She knew," Ethan said with certainty. "Before she died, she knew. She saw Edward as a boy and could project what he would become. She knew we had built something lasting." As the sun set in a spectacular display of orange and red and purple, painting the desert landscape in colors too vivid to be real, Ethan held his wife's hand and reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A letter, a leap of faith, a willingness to accept not just a bride but her grandmother too, such a simple decision but one that had changed everything. "I would do it all again," he said quietly. "Every moment, every choice, everything exactly the same. Even the hard parts," Penelope asked. "Dorothy's death, the droughts, the years when the cattle prices fell, even those," he confirmed. "Because they were part of the journey, part of what made us who we are. You cannot have the joy without risking the pain. And the joy, Penelope, the joy has been worth everything." She squeezed his hand tightly. "Yes," she whispered, "it has." They sat together as darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one in the vast Arizona sky. Inside the house, they could hear Grace playing the piano, a skill Dorothy had insisted she learn, claiming every young woman should know music. The melody drifted out to them, sweet and clear, and Ethan thought about how sound carried, how influence rippled outward like water, how one person's presence could shape generations. Dorothy had been gone for nearly 20 years, but her impact remained. In the values they taught their children, in the way they ran the ranch with integrity and compassion, in the stories they told around the dinner table, in the very foundation of their family. She had made their home richer with wisdom, but more than that, she had made their lives richer with love. And that, Ethan thought as he sat with his wife under the stars, was the greatest gift anyone could give. Not material wealth or even physical help, but the intangible treasures of wisdom, love, and the example of a life well lived. Years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable changes of time. Ethan and Penelope became grandparents multiple times over, their home once again filled with the laughter of children when the family gathered. They aged together, their hair turning silver, their steps slowing, but their love never dimming. On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1922, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even one great-grandchild, Ethan stood to make another toast. He was 71 now, his body bearing the marks of a life spent working the land, but his eyes were still bright and clear. 40 years ago, he began, and the room quieted to listen. I received a letter from a young woman in Philadelphia. She told me she was bringing her grandmother, and she offered to release me from our agreement if that was too much to ask. I wrote back and told her that my home would be richer for her grandmother's presence. I was right, but I did not know then just how right I would be. He looked at Penelope, who sat beside him, still beautiful in his eyes, still the woman he loved more than life itself. Dorothy Nash made our family possible. She taught us about loyalty and love and the importance of standing by the people who matter. She showed us that wisdom is the most valuable commodity, that experience and age should be honored, not dismissed. And she loved us all with a fierce, protective devotion that shaped who we became. He raised his glass higher. So tonight, as we celebrate 40 years of marriage, 4 children, 9 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild so far, I want to say thank you. Thank you to Penelope for taking a chance on a lonely rancher in Arizona. Thank you to Dorothy, who even now watches over us. And thank you to all of you for carrying forward the legacy of love and family that we started all those years ago. May you all be as blessed as I have been. The room erupted in applause and tears and laughter. Penelope stood and kissed him, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding tight to the woman who had given him everything he had ever wanted, and so much more than he had dared to dream. Later that night, when the guests had departed and the house was quiet, they walked together to the hill where Dorothy was buried. The moon was full, illuminating the desert in silver light, and the headstone gleamed. "We did good, grandmother," Penelope said softly, placing her hand on the cool stone. "We built the life you wanted for me. We raised good children we loved well. We honored your memory." Ethan stood beside his wife, his arm around her shoulders, and added his own words. "Thank you for trusting me with her. Thank you for being part of our family. You made my home richer with wisdom, but you made my heart richer with love. I hope we have made you proud." The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of continued life, continued growth. In that moment, standing together in the moonlight, Ethan and Penelope felt the presence of the woman who had made it all possible, who had taken a leap of faith with them and helped build something beautiful and lasting. They walked back to the house hand in hand, past the barns and corrals that housed generations of horses and cattle, past the gardens that had fed countless meals, past the memories embedded in every stone and beam. The Double J Ranch had started as one man's dream of building something meaningful. It had become a family legacy, a testament to love and loyalty and the wisdom of accepting people for who they are, not who you might want them to be. As they climbed the porch steps and turned to look out over the land one more time before going inside, Ethan thought about that long-ago day when he had read Penelope's letter and made the decision to accept both her and her grandmother. It had seemed like a small thing at the time, a simple act of decency, but it had been the foundation of everything good in his life. "No regrets?" Penelope asked, as if reading his thoughts. "Not a single one," he said firmly. "You brought me your grandmother and I gained a family. You brought me love and I gained a life. You brought me hope and I gained a future. How could I possibly regret any of that?" She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they stood together in the doorway, balanced between the past and the future, between memory and hope, between what was and what would be. Inside the house, a clock chimed the hour. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new chapters in the ongoing story of their family. But tonight, they simply stood together, grateful for every moment that had brought them to this place. Grateful for the mail-order bride who brought her grandmother, grateful for the rancher who said his home had become richer with wisdom and meant it with his whole heart. And in the grand sweep of their lives, in the legacy they would leave behind, in the stories their grandchildren would tell their own children someday, that moment of acceptance, that choice to welcome both Penelope and Dorothy, would be remembered as the beginning of everything beautiful. A small act of kindness that rippled outward through the years, creating waves of love that would touch generations yet unborn. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, The desert breathed its evening song, and the Double J Ranch settled into sleep, secure in the knowledge that it was not just land and buildings, but a home built on the bedrock of love, strengthened by the mortar of wisdom, and sheltered by the enduring embrace of family. And that was the truest wealth of all.